Good morning. Welcome to, can you hear me?
Good morning.
Good morning. They can hear me.
They can hear you. They're just talking over.
Huh?
They can hear you.
All right. Good morning and welcome to the Exploring the Faith session at First Presbyterian Church. And as we all know, we are welcoming two new resident ministers this fall. And last week we heard from Hannah Richards, and today we are honored to have Sarah Rutherford here to share her story and tell us a little bit about her and her call. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Oh, I also want to welcome all of you who are visiting us and virtually. Glad to have you with us virtually also. So let's go ahead and get started with our questions to Sarah. Thank you. Welcome. So, to start us off, can you share a little bit about your family and your early background, including your church involvement that you experienced?
Yeah. Thanks, Diane. I have my own mic. Thank you. I'm very special, I guess. Yes, it is such a pleasure to be here, and it was such a pleasure to hear Hannah last week. I love hearing Hannah's story, and one of the things I think is really beautiful about the two of us being resident ministers together is we both have very different stories and experiences. And so it's exciting to share that with you all today. I grew up in Dallas, Texas. I was always raised in a Presbyterian church, PCUSA. My family was always very involved in the church. My parents are both elders. My mother teaches Sunday school and children's handbell choir. My father's involved in various groups at the church. And church was just always a big part of life, as it is, I think, for many people who grew up in strong church communities. My church had big music ministries. The church still has 4 handbell choirs, and I started ringing handbells when I was 9 and doing church choir. And a big part of my faith formation as a youth was that my church youth choir and handbell choir would go on tour every summer. And so we'd go to different parts of the country, and we'd do concerts at retirement homes and homeless shelters and churches. And it really gave me a chance to be exposed to churches all over the country and to see, these other communities of faith that may look very different from mine, but that were still, the same church. And to get to be in so many different places and to bring music into that space. And to get the pleasure, of course, of traveling through airports with handbell cases, which is a very educational experience, if nothing else. And so I was always really involved in the church. My friends were at church, very strong community. But of course, I didn't really think of becoming a pastor. It was not on my radar. And then in high school, I was really involved in a program called North Texas Celebration, which was a youth 4th day weekend. So if you ever heard of Curcio or Walk to Emmaus or Pilgrimage, that type of renewal weekend, it was a youth version that was local to Presbyterians in North Texas. And it was very youth-led, and I served as moderator my senior year of high school. So I was doing things like preparing a talk and recruiting staff and participants and doing volunteer training and all these activities. And it sort of started to occur to me, what if maybe I should think about this more? And that's how I first started to discern the call. I'm sorry, I think that's the next question.
That was the next question. She anticipated, that's fine.
Yes. Oh, also on the upbringing, I do have an older brother and a twin sister, so they were also a part of this experience.
So then, to follow up on that, so what are your areas, I guess, how did you respond to your calls?
Yeah.
So, and I think going on in the future.
Great. Great. Yeah, so I started to think maybe I should think about doing pastoral ministry at this point. But around the same time, my home church went through a bit of a situation with our presbytery, as occasionally happens. And long story short, a lot of things happened, a lot of bad blood. Our pastors left the church, both of them. a lot of things kind of happened that shouldn't. But the short story is that it made being a pastor look like an extremely unappealing career. And I was like, this does not seem like something I would want to do. But I guess that's the thing about a call, is that it's not all about what you think you want to do. And I think, in fact, in hindsight, that it was clarifying in a way, that it showed that this was a call, because it wasn't something that was just coming from me, because I knew quite certainly that it was not. And so I was like, well, maybe this is really from God. Later, someone told me that every call has two parts. There's the inward sense of call, when you discern that this is something that you're being called to. And there's the outward sense of call, when that call is affirmed in community and other people say, this is what we think you're being called to. And for me, and the person who told me this said, some calls might start inwardly or start outwardly, but eventually calls all have these two parts. And so for me, the call to pastoral ministry definitely started inwardly. It was something that I was discerning. And after it didn't go away when I told God I didn't want to, then I started to sort of accept that, okay, well, I'll go be a pastor then, but I'm just not going to serve in a congregation. There's lots of other places pastors can serve, hospitals and nonprofits. And I don't think I had a great idea of what exactly as an 18-year-old, but that was the general idea. And then I went straight into college around that time, kind of knowing that this would be my next step after college. And I would say college was when that call was really affirmed in community. That was the outward sense of call. I was very fortunate. I went to Texas A&M University, Gig'em Aggies. I forgot my ring today, so don't look too closely, but Gig'em Aggies. And I was involved in the UKirk campus ministry there. I had some really great mentors, and I started working part-time as a youth ministry intern at a Presbyterian church in College Station. And I had the most wonderful youth group. Not that I'm biased, but I think they were pretty great. And I also had some really great mentors of several ministers who really pushed me, who very much said, yes, we see this call in you, and invited me to learn more about that. So I started preaching in college by doing pulpit supply in the area. The first time I preached was on my 20th birthday at First Presbyterian Church of Caldwell, Texas, which is 30 minutes away from College Station, which is 90 minutes away from Houston. So it was very rural, very small congregation. I knew nothing of what I was doing. I had never studied theology or biblical studies or learned how to write a sermon. But I'm so grateful to that congregation and to the other congregations who welcomed me when I was a college student, who invited me into their church and listened to me preach and treated me like I was not some random 20-year-old, but like I was a real pastor. And that really, I think, helped me grow in confidence in my calling, that these people were so affirming of this call and very willing to overlook, the things that you don't really know when you're 20 years old. And of course, in this time, despite my vow to God that I was not going to serve in a church because that sounded awful, I started thinking, wow, congregational ministry is pretty cool. So God does have God's own way, right? And I think this was an example of that. And so I went straight so during college, I also did an internship at a program called The Center, which was with the Presbyterian of Baltimore, which is kind of like youth mission weeks in an urban context, really focused on community development and anti-racism efforts. And that was a really eye-opening experience, and also enabled me to meet and get to know people in that area of the country and what ministry was happening. And then my first summer of college, I also worked at Mo Ranch, which is a Presbyterian summer camp in the hill country of Texas. And so I went from college, I went straight into seminary. I considered 2 different seminaries, and they were both wonderful schools. And I remember visited one of them, and it was a great experience, and I have all the only good things to say about that school. And then I went to visit Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary. And I just remember having a moment in that visit weekend where it was so abundantly clear that this was where God was calling me. And I had really hoped to go see something else of the world, go a little farther away, but that was the call. And so I started at Austin Seminary in 2022, and was there until May of this year. During seminary, probably the most impactful and formative thing that I did was that I worked part-time at a shelter for unhoused asylum seekers called Casa Marianella. And the seminary had this thing called a service learning program. It's where the seminary paid me like a student worker, but instead of working at the seminary, I worked for this local nonprofit, which was such a gift since it gave me the ability to kind of set the limited amount of hours at this other nonprofit that didn't really have a job for me, but that was quite willing to accept a free employee. And I was really interested in this particular shelter because I speak French fluently, and they had a big need for that since they had a lot of West African residents, as well as folks from South America, Asia, all over the world. And that was very formative. I think it really brings home the gospel in a lot of ways, and especially, the whole welcome the stranger command when you're doing that, and when it is a rocky road, and when the immigration mechanisms of our government now, but also even when I started, created some very bad situations for many people. And so that was a huge part of my seminary experience, to go from, conjugating Hebrew verbs or other such fun activities, and then go from that right to the shelter. And it's like, this person needs food, and this person needs clothing, and this person just arrived with the clothing on their back and a jumbo Ziploc of immigration papers, and that's it. And there was so much, grief in that work, and there were times that I came home from a shift and just cried and cried and cried. But there was also so much joy and so much faith. And I think I did, there was a worship service in Spanish every month at the shelter itself. I also took a resident to church with me during that time as well. And all those experiences, I think, were also really key reminders of the universal church and of the globalness of Christianity and of faith. And I think that's continues to change how I see everything because I worked there. After my first year of seminary, I did my kind of supervised internship or field education in the Church of Scotland, which had not been part of my original plan for my life, again. But that was really incredible opportunity to see what the church looked like in this European context. And I think that gave me a lot more perspective on the Presbyterian Church USA and on the context that I grew up in, the PCUSA in Texas, which is a place in which Christian observance is very common. And then going to Scotland, where it's kind of a different culture there, was really fascinating. And my second summer of seminary, I did my clinical pastoral education internship at Parkland Hospital in Dallas, which is the public hospital of Dallas County. You may know it as that is the hospital where John F. Kennedy died. And while he was there, he was given last rites by a Catholic chaplain at that hospital. So the spiritual care team at that time was very much a part of that experience as well. And that was a really interesting experience. The hospital was known for, it was a level 1 trauma center, and it was the regional burn clinic for all of North Texas. And I was mostly in the medical ICU and oncology floors. And that was also a really good experience and helped me practice my Spanish more. But this has meant that my liturgical Spanish is much better than my conversational Spanish, which can be a bit awkward when you're trying to use it in daily life. So I'm much better at praying in Spanish than I am at most other things in Spanish. And as I was finishing seminary, I knew I wanted to do a residency. It sounds kind of silly to say, but when people ask why a residency, why not a more long-term call, I really, I think this is true for all seminarians, but, I want to be a good pastor. And I think that a residency will help me do that and get more training and experience for whatever else the Holy Spirit leads me after this. And so I interviewed at several residencies. I actually interviewed at 3 consecutively on 3 different interview weekends in different states, which was an exciting adventure. And Ann Arbor was the second one. And it was very cold when I was here, which was a little bit of a con. But I just remember, I was trying to keep an open mind to all 3 of these, didn't know what I was doing, was sort of hitting that senior year discernment crisis moment that I think most seminarians have. And I just remember it being so clear that whole weekend that this is the next right step, that this was the place to which I was being called. And it was such a gift to know and feel that so strongly, and to feel so excited about coming here, to move from that senior year discernment crisis to, oh my goodness, I get to do this next. to the point that I almost didn't go on the third weekend because it felt rude to go when I wasn't going to take the position. But I did go because I thought it'd be even ruder to cancel. And then when I got home that Sunday night, I signed the contract and sent it in for here. So it's been a very exciting 6 months since, a very full 6 months. And I think that brings us to here. I think I might have left out some things, Diane.
I think you did address it, but one of the questions was, were there other areas of interest in terms of your ministry that you might be interested in? So you definitely did talk about your interest in pastoral ministry.
Yes. Yeah, I would say congregational ministry in its most broad sense is my primary ministry interest. Within that, I do feel a special love for preaching and teaching. And that has been, I think, having started preaching very young, that's always been such a big part of my faith life. And it is such a joy to me to get to write sermons and to get to preach them. I have a particular love for the Hebrew Bible and a mild obsession with the book of Ruth. So those are also passions of mine when it comes to ministry. So if you think Ruth comes up a lot in my sermons in the next 2 years, that is why.
Okay. So what do you hope to gain from your residency here at First Pres?
I think it's just such a blessing to serve at a church that is so alive, and to have so many mentors, both on the staff in terms of pastoral mentors, but also in the congregation. So many people with such great experiences and wisdom to share, and to get to learn and grow and learn how to do things and try things is really exciting to me. And I think another blessing of the residency program is that it is so explicitly broad that you're really not focusing on one area of church ministry. Ideally, we will do some of all these different areas. And I'm just really excited to get to see such a variety of ministry contexts and areas and get to kind of learn from all of them, hopefully. And I really don't know what I'm doing next. My go-to interview answer, I think I gave this to you all in the interview, was, I'm open to where the Spirit leads me next, which is my very Christian way of saying I don't know. And so I think I'm also hoping in the next 2 years to do more discerning of what's the next right step for me and where is God leading me next in this life.
So I guess the other question is, how can we support you as a resident? Hopefully we're a teaching, learning congregation, and what can we do to help support you in your residency?
That is a great question, and I loved Hannah's answer from last week. I think it does come down to on one hand, be gentle because we're new, and on the other hand, we are real pastors, and we have trained for this some, and we are so excited to be here and bring lots of different experiences. So also please, treat us as you would treat another pastor on this staff. Aside from that, maybe be gentle part too. So that balance there of, we are here as pastors, and it is such a joy to be here with all of you. And we really appreciate your support and your welcome, and also getting to do ministry with you all.
I guess at this point we could open the questions to the participants here. So if anybody has a question they want to share with, ask Sarah.
You piqued my interest with your obsession about Ruth. Can you say a little bit about why you're so fired up and interested?
That's a great question. It's hard to trace exactly why, but I can tell you kind of how it happened. I've always thought it's an interesting book. I think in seminary I was very drawn to it thematically because I was working with so many migrant women, and the book of Ruth is kind of about a migrant woman. So I think that really kind of caught my interest initially. And the more I dig into Ruth, the more I'm so convinced that it is such a central story in Judaism and Christianity, and that it has so much to tell us about God and God's relationship with people and our relationship with people. And the most common word, not most common word, but a very prominent word and theme in the book of Ruth that I would argue, I think, and many scholars argue, that it all kind of comes back to this, is this word of hesed, which is often translated like love or loving kindness. In the Bible, it is a form of love, so that is true. It's also kind of hard to translate, as love often is. But it often reflects God's love, right? This unconditional love that is not just an emotion, but also this action of doing good for this love. And so across the Hebrew Bible in general, the word hesed is usually applied to God. Like sometimes in the Psalms, they'll talk about this love of God, this hesed of God. But hesed is also the way we are supposed to treat other people. And what's really interesting in the book of Ruth, the word hesed is used numerous times for numerous characters. But the first usage is that Naomi uses hesed talking to Ruth and her sister Orpah, sister-in-law Orpah. And she says, "You two have shown hesed to your husbands and to me. Now go home," and all that. And then Ruth refuses. And I think the fact that the book of Ruth starts by attributing this love of God to these women who are considered outsiders, these Moabite women, is really interesting and really tells us something about the book of Ruth and its view of people and how we're called to view God and God's relationship with these peoples that we might think of as they are not part of this covenant with God, right? They are not Israelites. And yet they are the ones first named in that book as showing this love associated with God. I also think I could talk about Ruth for forever. I actually did present a paper on Ruth at the Society of Biblical Literature last year. And so I have so many thoughts to say. I also think it's really interesting to consider why the book of Ruth may be included in the Bible, because it kind of doesn't fit any general narrative. It's said to be in the time of the Judges, but it's only kind of loosely, right? It definitely wasn't written in that time. It's a story from people later about the time of the Judges. So anyways, I could go on forever, and that's not really what this class is about. But if you ever want to have a conversation about Ruth, I am always available. I think that Journey is doing a book on Ruth in October. Yeah, aren't you?
Tuma's and Jordan's book.
I love that book. I might be there.
It's been very interesting. Very interesting.
That's awesome.
I'd be interested to know about your experiences in Scotland and what you learned from your visit there.
Yeah. Well, if it's okay with you, Graham, I might start with talking about how I ended up doing this internship in Scotland, and then I'll talk about what I kind of learned there. So I didn't really plan to do an internship in Scotland, but then the week before I started seminary, I was watching Great British Bake Off, and the winner of this one season was Scottish. It was the 2020 season, I think, that I was watching later. And I remember turning to my mother, who was in the room with me at the time, and saying, "What if I did an internship in Scotland?" And it was sort of an out of left field idea, because it should come as no surprise to you that when you're in the ordination process in the PCUSA, you have to do your internship in the PCUSA. And so I thought it was, not going to work out. But it kept sticking with me. And so I asked these two people to pray about it for me. And within a week later, I got the clearest yes I've ever received. Just out of the sky, this is the next step. It was this really unexpected grant that I hadn't kind of forgotten I applied for. Definitely had not budgeted on. And within 6 weeks from that point, I had an internship and a place to stay and funding to make this happen. And I was like, well, okay, I'm going. And I think something that was so fascinating in the Church of Scotland was that in some ways it was so similar, and in other ways it was so different. Something that surprised me was that it was many of the churches, and again, I don't want to paint too broad of a brush, because I was primarily with two different churches, one in Edinburgh, one in a village in Aberdeenshire. And so I had limited contact with other churches along the way. But they tended to be less programmatic. So at this church, there's things that happen at the church every day, and all these groups and activities. And many of these churches, Sunday was the center of the week. It was this worship and this time together. And so it was a bit of a different kind of rhythm of life in the church. And the church in Edinburgh was in the process of going through a rather difficult merge with two other congregations. And, it was not a pretty process. I do not think it brought out the best in people in that particular situation. I think that was actually a really good lesson for me to see as this young seminarian of, in some ways, a little bit of what not to do in that case, but also recognizing that it's not quite so easy to say, well, I wouldn't do it that way. Because the truth is, it's really hard to make those kind of changes, and it's really hard to feel like your church is changing. And I think more than anything, that gave me a lot more compassion for people who are in difficult processes as churches and as congregations, and a lot more attention to the pastoral care that that process involves and the difficulty of that, and how important it is to, even in seasons that are stressful as a congregation, to also remember that the ministry goes on, right? That this is a universal church, and that even if what you think of as your church changes, the Holy Spirit is still at work so powerfully. And we can rejoice in that, even as we grieve the loss of buildings or whatever it may be.
Of course, it's a similar situation in Troon. Dave here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Graham.
I'm curious to know, when you close your office door and you go home, what do you do?
That's a great question. I really love to read and to run and to travel. I would say those are where I primarily spend my time. Recently, I have been trying to see more of the area too. So yesterday, I went out to the Arab American Museum in Dearborn, which was really interesting. And I also went to the farmers market for the first time yesterday. But yeah, I've also really enjoyed just running in Ann Arbor and getting to know the area more that way too. So, yeah.
What do you read for fun, Sarah?
What do I read for fun? I would say my 3 favorite genres are, 4 favorite genres. In general, I do enjoy reading a book about God. I'm currently reading a commentary in the book of Jonah by Juliana Claessens, which has been really fun. It's a little dense, but I'm getting my way through it. I also really enjoy reading memoirs, murder mysteries, and romance novels. So a recent memoir I read, it's sort of a memoir, kind of a book designed for discussion groups. It was called Here, A Spirituality of Staying in a Culture of Leaving. This is something I've thought about recently as someone who just made a cross-country move, thinking about staying and leaving and those choices. And I really enjoyed that book. And I actually wrote a review on it for Young Clergywomen International's website, which was really fun. And then I just always enjoy a good murder mystery. Next on my list is Ashes to Ashes, that we heard the Lindvalls talk about a few weeks ago. So I'm excited for that.
Anyone else? Chris?
Sarah, this may or may not be true, but did I hear you're trying to run a marathon in every continent? And if so, where do you stand in that process?
So I have run a marathon, and I've been to 6 continents, but I do not think I'm going to get a marathon in every continent, but I am really excited to hopefully get a 7th continent in the next 2 years. I didn't think I cared that much about getting all 7 continents. And then I got 6, and I was like, actually, now I care a lot. So that's been a new hobby and interest is getting to my last continent, which will be the highest peak in every continent. That sounds very hard. I'm not sure I'm quite experienced or interested enough for that, but you never know. I will go where the Spirit leads. So.
So which continent awaits you?
Australia. So yeah. Nancy. Oh.
I think newcomers to organizations always have fresh eyes in sort of looking at what is distinctive and maybe what surprises you. And I would love to hear, as a relative newcomer, your impressions of what is distinctive about this church. And it doesn't have to be just all the really nice stuff. I'm just really, really curious about it. Because now that we're all in it, it's almost like you swim and you can't see what's unique. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That is a great question. I'm a little hesitant because I just haven't been here that long. it's been, I guess, 5 or 6 weeks now, and it's just been such a whirlwind that I feel like I sort of haven't stopped to breathe a ton. But, obviously I've loved the church so much, and everyone has been so welcoming and supportive. And I've really enjoyed kind of very slowly working my way around and going to different groups and Bible studies and getting to see a little more glimpses. I think in a church of this size, it's bigger than the church I grew up at, and it's just been so exciting to get to, there's so much happening, and I feel like I'm still kind of slowly like digging my way in a little more. But I think, the music ministries at this church obviously have been such a joy, and I've been ringing handbells again in Sanctus Ringers, which has been really fun. And I don't know, it's hard to say, again, it's just been so much at once. It's hard to pin down what surprised me, but it has been a really positive experience so far, and I'm just really excited to keep going and keep learning more about what's happening in the life of this church and with the many people of it.
No rush. You really have, in many ways, grown up inside the church. You, Kirk, very positive experiences in your own home parish and so on. PCUSA ministers, Presbyterian Reformed tradition, is a kind of learned tradition, and as a former college faculty member, I'm curious to see what your intellectual as opposed to theological journey was, given the fact that you were a French major and sociology, I think. And I'm just curious to see how you put those two sides of what a reformed ministry is.
Yeah,
how you
thank
put it together.
That's a great question. Yeah, so I actually don't think I mentioned this in my little spiel at the beginning, so my apologies. But in undergrad, I majored in religious studies with minors in French and sociology. And I also did a graduate certificate in nonprofit management. And I think it was really good for me to go to such a huge school with such a diversity of students at it. And also go to a very, a state school. It was not associated with any religious tradition. I think also when you have grown up in a denomination your whole life, it does become sort of, I think someone said the water, right? That it's so normal to you that you almost don't notice many parts of it. And I think going to Texas A&M University kind of gave me a chance to kind of step back a little bit, to get to know students and face other traditions. And by studying religious studies from a very secular point of view, it was much like very sociology of religion heavy, I would say. To get to kind of see more of that from the outside. So in college, I was really interested in the ordination of women, mostly because for the first time in my life, I really met a lot of people who didn't think I should be ordained as a woman. And that became kind of a consuming research interest, kind of like the Book of Ruth has been since then in seminary. So my undergraduate thesis was looking at the factors that impact women clergy's decisions to stay in or leave pastoral ministry. Because there was kind of data that showed between 1998 and 2018, mainline Protestant seminaries essentially their graduating classes were around 50% female in the data they reported. And yet during that 20 years, the proportion of women clergy serving in those denominations remained very steady at around 30%. And so it's like if there's all these, if the kind of body of people who are theoretically qualified to be clergy serving in churches, congregational ministry, are 50% women, then why do we have this kind of persistent gender gap within the field? And so I interviewed 17 clergy women in Brazos County, which is where Texas A&M is, and in Harris County in Houston, and talked to clergy about the factors that influence their decisions to stay in pastoral ministry or leave pastoral ministry. And some of the clergy I interviewed had left pastoral ministry. And that was a really, I think, interesting study that also gave me a chance to do this independent research and also gave me a lot more perspective about what being a pastor is like. I think it helped me kind of go into seminary eyes wide open, that, this is not all sunshine and roses, and yet, it's worth doing anyways. And then another thing I did in college, research project I did in college is I was on this research team called Overchurched, Underfed. And we looked at religiously affiliated food pantries in the Brazos Valley, because all of the food pantries in our 5-county region were religiously affiliated. And that was just, the people who were out there doing that that work, right? It was not our county it was surrounded by a lot of very rural counties. Texas A&M is. Texas A&M likes to say it's in the middle of the Texas Triangle, which is a way of saying it's not actually near any city. It's just in the middle. And that was really, we did like a participant observation ethnography. So we would go volunteer at these different food pantries and take field notes and then analyze them. And so it was a team, and we grew hundreds of field notes. Then we looked at, it was someone's PhD project. And then kind of an outshoot of that project, and it's kind of a longer story to how it ended up here, but basically in 2021, I was basically paid for a semester as a research assistant to help install container gardens on the grounds of local religious congregations. And so we wanted to kind of, because we were looking at religious institutions and how they assist with food insecurity and food justice. And so I worked with a mosque, the Jewish Student Center, a Presbyterian USA church, and then a Black Baptist church. And I got to work with these 4 different congregations and facilitate the installation of these container gardens. And that was a really incredible chance to have a lot of interfaith engagement in a way that wasn't just kind of like a more formal sit and talk about it, but like was let's go purge the Jewish Student Center for any cardboard they have left for the gardens because we ran out, just like to have all these interactions with these communities. And I ended up going to several events at all of the places too. I got to know people there and became friends. And that was also, I think, really good perspective as someone who has stayed in the denomination of her birth and who was like baptized, confirmed, ordained, all at the same church. And then to get more experiences with other faiths and other traditions and how that works. So anyways, thank you.
I guess I have a question to follow up with you, because I find it unique that you have this nonprofit certification experience. And since I come from a nonprofit, it's particularly interesting to me. How do you think that can be beneficial to you in congregational ministry?
Yeah, so I first took the certificate because I was like, well, churches are legally nonprofits, 501c3s. And I wanted to kind of learn more. I think this will be helpful. People always say that seminary could give you more practical business side of things skills sometimes. And I was like, this is a great chance to get those skills. And I think it did, and I learned a lot about things like grant writing and tax forms, all of which are useful. But I think something I did not expect going into it that's been such a big takeaway is it gave me a lot more perspective on kind of the part the church plays in the greater civil society arena, and understanding more about why do nonprofits exist, right? Like what gaps do they fill, or how do they come to be? How do churches interact in that space? What is our kind of part with the larger community, including the government, nonprofits, for-profit businesses? And that was just really interesting. And to get to kind of learn so much about this field that I think most people often end up in kind of without really knowing they're going to. And so to get to kind of sit down and learn so much and study it, and I got to co-write a grant with a local nonprofit, and to have those experiences, I think were really valuable, and I hope will be very useful in my pastoral ministry.
Any other questions?
Nancy's had a question for a bit.
Yes, I find myself thinking, we're so grateful for youthful people coming in and leading us. But I'm wondering often how it is for young pastors coming into the ministry in a time when interest in PCUSA or many mainline churches particularly is really fading within the larger society. Many churches are closing their doors. The articles I read in the literature about how to successfully close your church. So I wonder, how does that impact you and Hannah too? And how do you feel any pressure as a young person sort of swimming against the tide of our culture? The churches that are doing better often are the more conservative vein of Christianity. And obviously we're not there. So just your thoughts.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. Yeah, I'd be curious to hear Hannah's thoughts on this sometime, because I think my experience is very much shaped by having had such an incredible growing up in the church. My religious experience my entire life has been very positive on the whole. And I learned so much about the love of God from my home congregation. and it was so special to be ordained there earlier this year. And I think sometimes coming from the inside, like I do, it's hard to understand why people, especially I guess my generation, are less interested in the PCUSA. You know, I'm like, and churches like it. You know, for me, it's like, well, why wouldn't you be, right? Like, this is, here is your solution, right? Like, and yet, I think it's very real that many young adults aren't interested in church or find themselves more interested in a more conservative type of Christianity. And even the people I grew up with at my home church, you know, some of them are still involved and still active in PCUSA churches, but also many of them are not. And I think that is something that I think it's just having had such the experience I've had, I'm not sure I have any explanation to give, since clearly that process never happened to me. And yet, I do kind of, it does, of course, lead the questions of what next, right? And how do we go forward? And I think sometimes it's really tempting to like pin our hopes on if we can just bring in young people, then we'll be okay, right? Because we have this natural anxiety about the future of the church sometimes. And I think that's very natural and normal. And we also can't kind of pin that anxiety onto people who are under 30 or under 40. And so how do we kind of approach that, knowing there is such a need, I think, for this ministry amongst young people? You know, I do think the PCUSA has so much to offer and is such a special space of this Christianity that is inclusive and affirming and loving. And obviously I firmly believe that or I wouldn't be here, right? But I do, I think that's true. And I also think we have to be careful not to pin our salvation on young people, whether that's young pastors or college students or whatever it may be. And we have to remember that ultimately, right, our salvation is Christ. And we have to kind of leave that anxiety with God alone. And that is the only real hope for the church, right, is in our Lord. And strive to do the work of the church faithfully as much as we can with young people and also with folks who maybe are not as young. And, you know, to love mercy and do justice and walk humbly with God.
Anything else?
Well, thank you so much for sharing your call and all of your little bit about yourself and hopefully how we can support you as you go on with this. Just a small gift.
Thank you.
Of appreciation on behalf of the committee. And we'll be here next week, but we might be here a little bit later because there is a congregational meeting, as I understand, that will elect the elders and deacons. But then we will have the adult sessions right after that. And we will be having Brent Ivy come and talk a little bit about the theology of stewardship. So we're looking forward to that. So thank you for being here, and I'm sure Sarah will stay around a little bit if people want to ask her some individual questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you.